Okay, looks like we've got a quorum here, so maybe we'll get underway. Just very briefly, I'm Simon Martin. I'm a partner here at Hudson Gavin Martin.
And I'm Andrew Dentice. I'm a principal at HGM. Before we kind of kick off the webinar proper today, just wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing why we're doing this tech transformation series. So this is the first of 7 webinars that we're running over the course of the next few weeks. Sort of came about obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic creating a bit of a hell of a year. We wanted to do something, I guess, to recognise what people are going through at the moment. And one of the things we've definitely sort of seen as a tech-focused firm is the fact that technology, digital transformation is becoming a huge issue for lots of businesses and government organisations as well. So whether that's new, digital communication means like Zoom, which we're using today, whether it's government announcing huge investment in health sector data, e-commerce solutions, payments technology, which is obviously coming to the fore even more these days. And obviously the risks of getting it wrong as well. So we've seen recently some of the cyber attacks on critical infrastructure here in New Zealand. Whatever way you look at it, technology transformation is absolutely going to play a key part in our recovery from the pandemic. And so in this first session, we wanted to kick things off with a sort of high-level look at technology transformation deals. As a firm, we act for both suppliers and customers in this space. And so I guess we wanted to come at it from both those angles today. So Simon and I'll be taking the supplier role in some of these discussions, and Simon will cover the customer angle. And look, despite the bad press that we get as lawyers, sometimes we do genuinely want to see these transactions succeed. We want to see win-win solutions for both suppliers and customers, and we want tech transformation to play a role in our kind of COVID recovery. And so, again, getting technology on the front page for the right reasons is what we're all about. So before I hand over to Simon to discuss some of the themes, the wider themes for tech transformation, just a little bit of housekeeping. With the Q&A function, we're going to save questions to the end. And so if you've got questions on the way through as we're presenting, just type them into the Q&A function within Zoom, and then we'll try to cover those off at the end of the session. So with that, hand over to Simon to have a look at the wider tech transformation landscape.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, as Andrew's already kind of alluded to, one of the key things to kind of just keep in mind as part of this is that there is really no right or wrong answer in relation to these kind of deals. The most important thing is to kind of have a discussion about the points that we're about to talk about. Make sure that there's a clear understanding that the cost, the risk, the benefit are all assessed, and make sure that the deal at the end of it fits what you need it to fit. But I guess if we're going to look at the landscape and what's going on at the moment, I think it's safe to say that while kind of large-scale transactions, large-scale IT projects or technology projects have not disappeared altogether, they're certainly becoming far less common than they have been in the past. What we're seeing is, and in actual fact, I kind of watched with interest kind of the reaction from the tech sector as a whole in recent times with some government large-scale projects where they were looking at, in relation to the likes of the IRD and that, where they were looking at kind of large systems that were going to be kind of all-encompassing, and the sector reaction that they weren't entirely sure that that was the best outcome for everybody involved. Certainly not the old one system to rule them all type approach is not being seen as kind of a standard and safe approach in many circumstances these days. And so what we're looking at is a much more kind of commoditized version of kind of tech solutions. That is, smaller solutions that are very specific at delivering certain outcomes that are all designed to kind of work together to give you the outcome for the business that you're looking at. They're very much more targeted and are designed to be kind of much more open for ease of use with everybody. We are looking at the cloud solutions becoming much more prevalent, and with cloud you are actually moving into that kind of commoditized outcome. The offering becoming much more kind of standard that you have to kind of look at how your business can use the solution in the way it is. That there is a kind of a cost element, a reduction of cost, because there is a much more standardized kind of approach to delivering the solution to you. But at the same time, you then need to make sure that you can use that solution in its standardized form. We are moving away from kind of bespoke software being written. We don't see that so much anymore. I mean, we certainly are seeing customized solutions being less common as well. So taking standard software, making custom, getting into the code, making custom changes to it. And part of the reason for that is the difficulty or the risk involved in getting that wrong, but also the difficulty in continuing to support it as the software continues to involve the cost and the effort involved in having to try and keep that, keep your customized versions up to date. So it's getting much more into a kind of configured version where things are able to be kind of shaped within the standard offering. On the services side, we are looking at implementation changing as a result of there being less kind of customization, much more configuration. So implementation theoretically becomes a lower risk. And the support side changes because the way in which that solution is being made available is very much more service driven rather than, here's your software, use it on this, and we will kind of, help you out when you raise your hand. So there's very much more a kind of a wraparound solution or service that's coming in as part of this. And then of course the way in which it's all being used enables everybody to understand a little better how the business uses it, what kind of transactions are happening, what kind of data is being collected, and that enables the business itself to actually improve the way in which it engages in its dealings with its third-party suppliers, its customers within the business. But data is a whole topic in itself, and actually we're going to have a conversation about that as a separate tech transformation seminar at some point. So we're really looking at, at this thing being kind of a much more standardized offering, which hopefully in itself makes it easier to kind of implement, easier to support. But within that, you need to start to look at, can you work within the confines of that standard? And if you can't, can they be changed? What are the costs of that? What are the risks of that? And what are the benefits for you?
Very good. So we're going to move on now and break this down a little bit and discuss some of the key themes that we're seeing as we advise on technology deals at the moment. And as a first step in the journey, usually it's implementing the software or the technology solution. And so, Simon, from a customer's perspective, what are some of the things that we're seeing?
Well, it's one of the problems that we've always had when you start these processes and when you start to try and develop and deliver a solution for a business is that there's imperfect knowledge, and there's actually imperfect knowledge on both sides. The customer understands or think they understand how their business is operating, but the supplier doesn't necessarily understand how transactions flow through it. But what they do know is that they know their solution. They know how their solution takes data, how their solution kind of processes transactions. And so what we're seeing now is more common is seeing a discovery or a scoping phase where the parties kind of sit together and they understand how the solution works, how the business operates, how transactions move through that business, and therefore how that might kind of work within the confines of the technology solution. The challenge that you've got from a customer perspective in relation to this is if you kind of make an investment at this point in time with a supplier, there is a risk that at the end of it you may have discovered that actually this is not quite the right solution for you. So there is a degree of, kind of need to do your due diligence in advance to make sure that as you start to make this commitment on the scoping side of things, and you start to pay for things, that you understand that there is a fair chance that you can get the outcome that you need. Then the discovery or scoping phase is a commitment by the customer to make sure that the solution is what they need, understand better what it is that they are going to be looking for. That requires an investment from them, and that in itself becomes a little bit of a barrier to kind of then saying, well, actually that $50,000 or whatever it is that I've invested at this point, that is not able to be used, and I'm going to have to move somewhere else, which is not something that anybody wants, but it becomes that barrier to leaving. So as part of going into the scoping, it's important to make sure that what you get out the other side of the scoping is something that that still has some value to you, that you understand the way in which your transactions move through your business, that understand the way in which your data is captured, understand the kind of the data that you need to move forward. So at least if you do have to make that call, that you have the ability to use or reuse at least some of it.
Yeah, and I think from a supplier's perspective, this should be, again, a win-win thing for both parties to understand the environment that they're working in before we pull the trigger on the license. As a supplier, I don't see this as a kind of mini RFP, so I've got the deal. This is almost a value-add service for me to say, I'm happy to come in and have a look at how you think you're going to implement my solution and to make sure it works. It's not sort of necessarily about relitigating the contract or giving you a way out at the end of it, because obviously that's going to be difficult for me as a supplier if all my customers are doing that. So I think in terms of giving you something back at the end of, as well, if the customer did have the ability to pull the trigger at the end of discovery, I don't want to be giving away my IP. So it's actually, ideally this would be a great success. If it's not, what am I prepared to give you at the end of it?
And there really is no right or wrong answer to this. It's about making sure that you understand that, from a customer perspective and from a supplier's perspective, that you're comfortable with the outcome that may happen one way or the other in relation to this. So you go through this scoping phase. You understand at the end of it that this is something that's going to work, and now you want to move through into an actual implementation. And you could actually be doing this through your scoping phase as well. The traditional approach has been kind of this waterfall approach, which is I'm starting here, I want to get to here, therefore this is the flow, this is what's going to happen, and that's what's going to happen under the contract. The challenge with that is, as we've said, you've got imperfect knowledge at the beginning. And as a result of that imperfect knowledge, it may be that what you desire as your outcome is actually not going to work for the best for the business at the end of it. And that is something that you will learn as you go through the process. Doesn't matter how good your scoping phase is, I don't think that you're ever going to be able to kind of discover all of those issues that might be worked through as you go through the full scale kind of implementation. And so a different practice is developed, which is agile. And as the title would suggest, it's a process which is probably a little bit more dynamic. What it is in some ways, it's almost like a series of kind of smaller waterfall processes where you kind of have an aim for the end of a sprint or whatever. And you look at the end of that and you say, well, what have we learned? Does that mean that our next outcome should be slightly different to what we were planning it to be? And you always are kind of going back and looking at what you've learned and how that could change where you want to get to next. The real risk from a customer perspective in relation to this is that you have to make sure that there is strong project management and strong documentation throughout the process, just to make sure that you don't end up losing focus on the things that are important to you. It may be that end destination is not what you want, but you need to make sure that that is a conscious decision, that you have kind of moved away from where you thought you wanted to get to somewhere else. And you're always wanting to keep an eye on, the time, the cost, and the outcome to make sure that at the end of it, you still have a successful project. But Agile gives you that ability to kind of learn on the way through. The risk that you run with a waterfall process, from a supplier perspective, is they don't know everything. And so there is a level of risk if they're committing to get to this outcome. And so they will build that risk factor into their contract if they, and you may well find that as a result of it, that there is extra cost that sits in the project as a result because of the supplier assuming that level of risk.
Yeah, and so there are pros and cons, I think, as you've mentioned, Simon, for suppliers on Agile versus Waterfall. I think generally what we're seeing is suppliers really like working in that Agile manner. One, because developers like to work that way. It's a much more dynamic and collaborative development approach or implementation approach, which generally we see suppliers really enjoying. And of course, it gives that flexibility to respond to changing circumstances, particularly if there's imperfect knowledge at the customer end about what it wants to achieve. And then obviously in terms of the supplier's perspective, much more likely to be a kind of time and materials type commercial model, which is obviously great. But again, you're not just going to be provided with a blank check on this stuff. And so what we have seen is sometimes with these implementation projects, it's kind of a hybrid model where you take Agile, you put some governance around how that implementation is going to work, with roles being played by the supplier and the customer side. You work in sprints, you use that governance model, but then there are some touch points around, whether it's estimates of the cost that it's going to involve, or milestones that need to be achieved by a certain time, just so that you're putting some contractual parameters around that process. And as I say, it's not a blank check.
Yeah, and certainly, with the way that solutions are being kind of stood up these days with and we're about to talk about it with the customization versus configuration, there is an element of, this being de-risked because of the nature of the solutions, that you're going to be looking to implement. And so as part of an Agile process, there is this kind of always this constant assessment as to, am I getting to the point that I want to get to? And some of that can then end up sitting within the customer's control. There is this box of things that they would like to achieve at the end of it, but they may, because of the process they're going through, only get a certain level of kind of the functionality that they're looking for as kind of phase one, or as the minimum viable product that gets stood up, and then they choose other things going forward. So that's kind of part of what we've seen as this hybrid is we can kind of make a commitment that you'll get at least this level of functionality, but you could, depending on what we learn, get more. Lots of different ways that we've seen this being cut, but certainly a hybrid is becoming a little bit more common. So then what we're looking at next is this configuration versus customization, and it's fair to say that customization comes with a degree of kind of challenge for any customer, because with a customization, you're getting into the code and you're having to change it for the specific needs of that customer. And the challenge that you've got there is that as the software continues to evolve, the customization has to continue to move with it, and that comes with a cost. And that's a cost in relation to just continuing to move it forwards, but also if issues arise while you were using it, the cost of having to continue to have somebody that understands those customizations, whether it's somebody within your own business or whether it's the supplier's business, in terms of having to pay to keep that kind of working. So configuration is actually, a lot of the software nowadays is coming in a format where there is flexibility about how you can use it, whether that is you want to capture data in this way, whether you want to report in this way, whether you want to engage with the customer in this way. And those are all things that can be configured. So the software itself doesn't change. It's just the way in which you engage with it, the way in which it captures data is kind of set up and stood up in a slightly different way. The theory behind that is it makes a standard piece of software much more available to a lot more people without there being kind of a need to continue to change the underlying code. So as that underlying code continues to evolve, theoretically your software doesn't need to change because it's changing as part of that development part. The other side of it is it also hopefully makes it easier to actually do the implementation and have this thing shaped for you.
Yeah, and as a supplier, I guess I'm just making sure that my customer is kind of on board with how this is going to work. Sometimes that distinction between a configuration and a customization is not always clear, certainly not to customers who haven't done a lot of this stuff in the past. And so making it quite clear that if you want something specific done for you, that's not within the confines of my product, that's going to cost, because that's going to be development time from my engineers to make that happen. So it's bringing the customer along on that journey, helping them understand the benefit of the software that you provide and the configurations that you can do or even they can do within that, versus having to do that further development work, which obviously is sometimes necessary depending on the customer.
Yeah, and look, I mean, again, it's one of those honest conversations that has to happen, because I think too often there is this risk that when you get into these projects, people kind of assume that you're going to be able to change the business to meet the software, and that's got to be an honest conversation that happens. Can we do that, or are you creating barriers to the adoption of the software because the business just cannot change in that way? Those things need to be talked about and considered from both sides in relation to this, because one of the challenges with a configuration model that you've got is that there are only certain things that can be done. There may be a huge level of flexibility, but you may need to embrace that customization, but you need to understand that there is a cost to that and there is a risk to that as well. So once you're kind of getting down this path of, if you are going to do some kind of customization, who should own that customization? And the natural inclination from anybody that pays for something is, if I've paid for it, well, I want to own it. But the challenge that I would put to a customer in relation to this is, what's the value for you? What is the driver for you in relation to wanting to own this customization? Is it just because you're spending money, therefore you want to own it? Or is there something underlying that? Because the reality is that this customization is not going to be of an enormous amount of value without the underlying platform. So unless you're going to get into kind of being able to sell that underlying platform, you're not going to be able to sell that customization itself necessarily. So one of the things you need to assess is, why do I want it? If one of the reasons that you want it is because you want to make sure that you maintain your competitive edge, can that be achieved in other ways without owning it? Because the risk with owning the customization is that is definitely not going to be on the development path going forward. The supplier doesn't own it, and so it ends up sitting out here by itself and becomes something that, as this continues to evolve, you don't necessarily get this with it. So the challenge that you've got is, why do I want to own it? If it's that competitive edge, is it, then can you achieve that perhaps by restraints? Can you achieve that by kind of exclusivity for a period of time? Would those sort of things give you what you want? Of course, you need to be careful that your restraint isn't too extensive or too long, because again, if you make it so that they can't sell this to somebody else, then essentially they're not going to be supporting it. It's not going to be on the development path in itself. So it's again coming back to, why would you need to own that customization?
And that's the standard argument from a supplier's perspective is, part of the solution that we've developed is working with a whole bunch of customers, taking those lessons and actually incorporating that IP into our product. So the more customers that say we can't do that, the less successful our product's going to be, and that's often a very fair argument to use from a supplier's perspective. The other one to think through is that obviously if you're a technology vendor and you're keen to get investment on board or potentially have an exit strategy as time goes on, those investors or acquirers are going to want to see that you own your IP. So the more contracts that you have with customers with kind of funky IP positions where the customer has ownership rights or exclusivity, the less pleased generally those people are going to be. And so from that perspective, again, this is a conversation I think customers need to come to the party on.
Yeah. So then once we're working through this, the next thing to think about is, what environment does this solution need to work within? And part of this is about making sure that you've got the right kind of integration. Will the software work in the right ways with the environment that I'm operating within? And part of that is and some of this is kind of what happens during the scoping stage and what happens as you go through, if you're running an agile, as you go through that, and as you start to understand the different parts of the environment that it needs to operate within in terms of the other software that it needs to pull information from and share information with. And then it becomes a question of, well, who picks up the cost of making sure that integration happens? Is that capable? Is that configurable within the standard software itself? Is this something that you would expect to operate with, and who carries that risk? The less standard it becomes, obviously, the greater the risk that you'll get something that doesn't quite work, and there will be kind of extra effort that needs to be done to get it to work.
Yeah, and from the supplier standpoint, with integration with existing or third-party systems, I mean, my going-in position is that's all on you, customer. I know my solution, I'll make sure it works. But everything else is you or a third-party vendor making sure that that works. Where that probably doesn't hold so well is if I've made a whole song and dance about how my solution does integrate with a whole lot of other well-known solutions. Lots of providers are actually using their APIs as a real selling point these days, and so if you are doing that, then that comes with a level of expectation probably that your system is going to integrate nicely with the customer's existing systems. The other area is also where I myself am integrating third-party technology into the overall solution that I'm selling, and so at that point the customer probably rightly says, well, that's on you, that's part of what you're selling me. So that does get in, it's sometimes in contracts that discussion is a difficult one, but it's again about understanding where those touch points are, and actually the discovery process is often quite good for doing that.
Yeah. So then the final one, and this kind of naturally segues into the next bit, which is about the rights to use, but is the impact of the implementation on the license itself, and that becomes a question of when do I start paying for this license, and what should I start paying for this license? And the issue that you've got is that if a software supplier was going to license you the software and you're going to have an independent third party do the implementation with the configuration, you'd be paying for that license from day one. And sometimes the issue is the blurring of the lines. If the supplier is also implementing or configuring for you, should you be paying for that license from day one? And so that's one thing that you need to kind of look at is, do you pay for the license? Do you pay for a reduced license during that period of time because you're only using it in kind of a test environment or a non-production environment? So you need to think about those things. And then the other aspect of it, which is always kind of a little bit of a challenge, is this revenue recognition issue. And for those that aren't kind of familiar with it, one of the challenges that a supplier has from a kind of a finance and from a tax perspective is when do they get to recognize the revenue from the sale of the software? And different kind of tax regimes around the world won't allow you to recognize revenue for a software license if there is still some contingency to that software license. So if you take a software license but you want to be able to throw the software out if they can't implement it, then the challenge you've got is that the supplier or the vendor can't recognize that revenue until that contingency is gone. And this is a real challenge for them. So one of the things that ends up being debated is, well, who carries that risk about whether this thing can be successfully implemented? And the argument, obviously, from a customer point of view is, well, if you're saying that that your software is easy to implement, that it's configurable, and that all of this should be kind of stood up really easily, is why wouldn't you carry that risk? Because at the end of it, the concern we've got is that we've got a piece of software that we can't use because actually it proves that you can't stand it up in the way that we are looking for it to be stood up. So one of the debates is, where does that happen? And one of the things that we've found in the past is that maybe the way to attack this is not by making the software license kind of conditional, but recognizing in the implementation contract that actually, if it can't be implemented because the supplier has done something wrong, that in itself is a right to recover the cost of the license that is of no value to you. And that's certainly a discussion that's that should be had as part of this kind of implementation license approach.
Yeah, and as a supplier, it is an absolutely critical issue, because essentially that's how I make money, is the software license. It's how I recoup all the costs of my R&D. I'm generally not always or don't view myself as a service provider. This is about selling a software solution. And so to the extent that the implementation of it might scupper that deal, I'm going to be very sensitive to that. And so I think in terms of particularly as Simon mentioned before, in a world where we're doing much more kind of configuring of existing software, I would also be asking, well, is that really going to be my fault that you can't implement that as a customer? Much more likely it's because you didn't understand what your requirements were at the outset, and so I don't want to have to carry the can for that. And again, comes back to the more you can do in that discovery phase, the more you can understand where each other's coming from, the less likely that is to play out in a bad way down the track.
Yeah, and look, the good news with this is as things become much more standardized, much more easily configurable, the risk can start to kind of be managed in other ways. And so certainly, some of the stuff that you can look at is, if there is a cost element to, well, if you want us to assume that then there is a different cost in relation to this license, then maybe you look at it in other ways from a customer perspective. Is there somebody else, an independent third party that could implement it if the supplier can't implement it? There might be other ways that you can manage this risk where you feel comfortable that you don't need to kind of pay the impost of the risk being assumed by the supplier and them saying, well, that's going to come with this extra cost to it. So there's lots of different ways through it. Andrew and I did a deal just recently where actually the supplier was coming into the market. This was the first time that they'd kind of made a sale in this market. And so therefore, in those circumstances, there weren't other suppliers. And so this was a debate that was had at the table between the customer and the supplier but there is nobody else that can implement this if you can't. And so we need to have a conversation about what happens if the implementation doesn't work.
Very good. So implementation done, all sorted, easy as that. Next step in the process is working out, well, what am I actually getting as a customer, or what am I actually delivering as a supplier? And I think in these days where lots of solutions are SaaS-based, software as a service-based, what we're actually delivering is a right to access software that I, as the supplier, am in control of. So where traditionally I would develop software and throw it out into the world and let the customers use it, subject to various kind of license conditions. Here I've actually got much more practical control over how I manage the software and how I deliver it. And so that means I can kind of update it more regularly and tweak it, generally across the platform or for specific customers. And it also means I can probably grant access to that software on a more granular or precise basis, depending on what my commercial model is. And so some of the things that we see, I guess, in terms of the basis that the software is being provided, is it based on the amount of data that it's being processed? It could be the number of transactions that it delivers. It could be around things like numbers of users. And we are still seeing kind of flat subscription models being used as well in terms of the basis on which the use is being granted. Will everyone who needs it have access to it? So the things that both customers and suppliers are thinking about in this space is, I've got a customer, that's one entity, that's the person who signs the contract. Do they need their entire group to use it? Have they got a bunch of subsidiaries in various jurisdictions that might also need to have access to it? And how does that affect my business model and the way I'm going to charge, as well as my obligations to deliver the service? Might not be group entities, it might be a whole bunch of third-party contractors within the customer that also need to have access to my software. That might be fine because I might be being paid more for each person who uses it or for each transaction that's being done. But on the flip side, are those contractors potentially my competitors? And are they getting a kind of window into my secret source by the back door, essentially, by being a contractor to my customer? So that's something to work through. And then how does all this sort of affect the commercial model and the price being paid? So one of the things that we're seeing more and more actually at the moment is suppliers wanting to do sort of revenue share based models. So actually share in the upside when their solution is being used by a customer to drive further sales, further transactions. So that's a nice way, I guess, of incentivizing both parties to make the solution work. And we're seeing quite a bit more of that, I think, in the market. The other point, just to bear in mind in terms of access and payment, is traditionally software vendors used to use audit rights quite significantly to go into customers work out whether they've got the right license. If they're under licensed, charge a whole heap of extra fees on that basis. These days, the information flows sort of switched. So actually, as the SaaS vendor, I have a lot more control or a lot more access to know what my customers are doing with my product. And so that kind of audit right is not really being insisted on in the same way for lots of these transactions.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in some senses the information flow needs to go the other way, and so at sometimes the customer may need to have a degree of understanding and access and reporting back to make sure that they understand how the system and how the solution is being used, and therefore that they are paying the right kind of fee for it. From a customer perspective, they need to take a step back and look at and make a serious kind of assessment as to how this solution or system is going to be used. Is it going to be used by one entity? Is it going to be used across the enterprise? And what does that enterprise mean? Have we defined what a related company is? Is that only companies that are wholly owned? Have you taken into account joint ventures or unincorporated joint ventures that might need to have access to it? Have they got the licenses that they need? How many independent contractors do you have within your organization? Will they need to access it? Employees would be picked up, but independent contractors perhaps not. If this solution is being kind of woven into an offering that you make to the market, does it mean that your customers are going to need to use it? Do you have the rights to give those customers the right to use it and sub-license it? All of those sorts of things need to be thought about as part of this. And then on top of that, in terms of the kind of charging mechanism, are there volume discounts for for number of transactions or amount of data, and how does that step change occur? And is it clear that if you hit that next volume, when that happens and what the pricing is? What have you assumed about kind of hitting those different volumes, and what happens if, as part of that, you've assumed that you will own these entities and an entity is sold? Does that entity still have a right to use it for a period of time? Does that volume kind of continue to be able to be counted as part of your total volumes? If you acquire an entity, what process is there involved in onboarding, and how does that extra entity then become part of your calculation of what fees you end up having to pay? All of those things are things that you need to think about as part of kind of looking at your fee and right to use model. So then we start to look at support itself, and the interesting thing with kind of a SaaS model is that I guess support to some extent is actually baked into the service itself, because you can't get access to the software or to the solution unless that solution is available. And so as part of actually giving the right to use, there is effectively baked into it a bit of an availability commitment around this. But it's actually understanding what that availability commitment is. How many people can have access? How are you expecting the solution to work? And that's what you need to have a conversation around in terms of the support side. There are two elements to the support. There is that kind of bug fix element, and then there is the actual kind of just keeping this thing up to date, making sure it continues to work in the way that you thought it was going to work. And so we'll look at those slightly differently. In terms of the bug fix side of things and that element of it, there is a kind of a tendency that has developed about from suppliers to almost commoditize the levels of support. So you can have standard level support, you can have kind of silver level and gold level, and then from a customer perspective, it's about understanding how they're going to use the software, how the software is going to operate within their system, and therefore how much support they need. There's no point in paying for 24/7 if actually this is not business critical for you. If you can wait, if the system is not working quite right, then maybe look at that and look at whether a different level of support could be bought that's kind of going to work for you. And there's got to be an honest assessment about this, because obviously the more support you ask for, the more the supplier is going to have to provide, the more they're going to have to resource up in relation to it, and therefore there is a cost that they're going to need to pass through to you. So make sure you're making that assessment right around what it is. It may be that this is that this is kind of tax reporting software, and there's only a couple of times in a period that it needs to actually be up 24/7. The rest of the time, you've got a greater degree of control over what happens if it goes down. And so maybe there's a different way that you could approach it. But just because you could approach it in a different way doesn't mean that you're going to have that available to you, because as support becomes something that is commoditized, that may not be an offer. And so it's then looking at the different offers and working out whether one of them works best for you and which one's the right one for you. On the keeping up to date side, the thing there to really, and this comes back to a little bit that we've talked about already in terms of the implementation side, there are two elements to that. There is keeping up to date in terms of the environment that it operates in. If this is software that is designed to sit on top of, I don't know, on top of Oracle software, say, then at that point you need to know that if Oracle continues to change, that this solution will keep changing with it. And that's one of the things that you want to kind of make sure that you keep an eye on as part of that kind of ongoing support. The other element, of course, is if this is software that is designed, as I was talking about before, to work on tax reporting, then as the regulations change, you're going to want to know that this solution changes as well, and it keeps up to date with those regulations. And so what are the commitments around that? So those are the things from a customer perspective that you're going to want to think about. How am I using it? Therefore, what kind of up do I need in relation to it? Can I actually, because this is configurable, can I actually do some of that support myself? From a up-to-date point of view, it's about the what am I expecting this to do to keep up to date with this environment in terms of software technology and this environment in terms of the regulation that I'm operating within.
Yeah, and I think from a supplier perspective, that's an interesting question, and I'm only going to want to take any responsibility for that on the keeping up to date side of things if it's something that's built into my product or built into my service. So sure, if I'm selling you a tax compliance solution in your market, then absolutely I'm going to need to take some responsibility for that. If, however, I've got a whole bunch of customers using my solution in various different ways, and they just happen to be in high-risk areas from a regulatory perspective, I absolutely don't want to be taking on the risk of regulatory change in all those circumstances. So again, that's a conversation that is often a tough one within the contract, and each party will have its own kind of views as to how that plays out. From a responsibility standpoint as a supplier, and from a sort of standard versus gold-plated model, I'm going to want to productize my service, my support as much as possible, particularly if I'm operating in a kind of large environment with lots of customers. The more that customers are asking me to do sort of specific support, the more costs that obviously I'm going to incur with that. And so again, the other thing that we're seeing suppliers do actually is kind of offer almost like a train-the-trainer service, so that once you've configured the software, you can actually get your customers' tech teams involved in supporting it going forward, and that's quite a nice solution to some of these issues.
Yeah, and look, one of the other things to think about in relation to this is the potential for, not assuming that everything is going to be completely public cloud or private cloud, that there might be a community cloud, and so for some software, for example, kind of banking software, in the UK, it may be that the community as a whole kind of say, well, we need these requirements for our market, and therefore there is a kind of a commitment that sits, which is not bespoke to a bank, but to all banks that have to operate within that. And that may be kind of a hybrid between something that is specific to you and something that is basically, look, we'll do whatever we need to do in relation to all banks. So, there's all these kind of opportunities to explore this in terms of the way in which the solution and the service might be productized. So then we start to look at, what are the service levels? What is it that we're expecting? And that's something for the customer to take a step back from and kind of look at and look at what would happen if this business doesn't, what would happen to my business if this solution doesn't work, and how quickly would that happen? And that will then start to dictate what it is that you need to think about in terms of the service levels. And in some ways, the conversation about the support is probably as important, if not more important, than the warranty conversation, because nobody, well, not that I'm aware of, nobody goes into a contract with the expectation they're going to sue the counterparty in relation to it. That might be something that happens because something fails, catastrophically. But in most circumstances, the parties want to work out a way that they can work together and remedy kind of things that happen and continue to kind of have a viable relationship going forward. So the conversation around service levels is actually probably a more important one in terms of understanding what happens when things go wrong and how is it going to be managed. And that's about kind of pulling apart some of these commitments, say the availability commitment. If you've got something that is business critical and you're asking for it to be up 24/7, right throughout the year, then a 95% availability measured monthly becomes a bit of an issue, possibly, because 8 hours, and you're still sitting round about the 95%. You might be comfortable with that, provided that whole 8 hours doesn't happen at one time. And so it can be about kind of looking at what you actually need and then kind of unpicking that and going, well, how would that work if that all happened at once? How would that work, if I could spread that over a period of time and have that conversation around the service levels? And again, it comes back to, I need this, and the customer is saying that this is what's critical to me to run my business. If I can't, then I've got a real problem. From the supplier perspective, when they're looking at the kind of the productized thing, they're going, well, these are my solutions. And so you just need to kind of have that conversation with the supplier about where you can get to.
Exactly, and some customers will require that, but I think if that more sort of targeted solution from a support and availability perspective, obviously as a supplier, the more customers who are asking for different solutions, the harder it is for me to deliver. So again, I'm trying to be as standardized as possible with the availability and support levels that I'm offering. Some things to think about, I guess, maintenance windows. So again, have that engineered as regularly and as standardized as possible, so that downtime, scheduled downtime for the software is happening at the same time across the board. Thinking about time zones, possibly where my support teams are based. If my customers are in a whole bunch of different time zones, how is that going to affect what clients in particular geographies are asking for from an SLA and even from an availability perspective. And then lots of SaaS solutions actually depend on a number of third-party vendors themselves, and particularly thinking about infrastructure hosting providers. The support that they provide needs to then be flowed down to the ultimate customer. And so as a supplier, I need to be very clear with my customers what is within my control and what is a service that I'm essentially just passing on to them in terms of support. I think on the warranties side, it's an interesting point. I think you're right, Simon. The support rather than the warranty can actually be the most important thing in a lot of these deals. And what we're seeing in the market is, despite the fact that SaaS is slightly different to kind of old school software licensing, warranties are still relatively short in length. So, I might get 30 days, or I might give 30 or 90 days from go live, and then actually you're relying on that support, because obviously that's baked into the business model. So I think, yeah, absolutely, that the support schedules are something that lawyers need to look at just as much, if not more, as the warranties in the front end of the contract.
Yeah, and look, another thing to think about with the kind of the support side is not just what's on the paper, but what's not on the paper, in terms of, if you kind of say, look, I need a 99%, a 95%, a 90%, what happens after 90%? What are the remedies after 90%? Because, if 89% and 10% are treated just the same, then you've got a bit of a problem. So one of the things to also think about in all of this is, what happens at each point and what happens after that. So those are really important things to kind of talk about. And unfortunately, that then leads to the next conversation, which is about exit. And one of the things that I would, and perhaps I'm coming across as a bit of a forecaster of doom here by saying, when you go into the contract, you should be thinking about how you would exit from the contract. And in the past, when we've done kind of significant outsourcings, so that is kind of a capability that you've built internally that you then get a third-party supplier to build and provide to you. My conversation around those has always been, what would happen if that doesn't work? How can you rebuild that internally? And if you can't do that, and if your business would grind to a halt as a result of not being able to do that in an easy manner, then that's a problem, and that's maybe something that you shouldn't think about outsourcing. In this case, what we're talking about with business solutions is, how critical will this be to your business? And if there is a disruption to it, what would happen? And so as part of your conversation at the beginning And as part of kind of understanding how you engage with the supplier, you want to understand how you would disengage from that supplier. And so it may be, for example, that there's two kind of choices in the market. One is an Amazon, a solution that's built on an Amazon stack, and one's a solution built on an Azure stack. You decide to go with the Amazon one because you like the functionality out of it. If that ended, what do you have to do to stand up the alternative? You've got to get the license, you've got to take your data across, you've got to kind of do the deal to kind of move everything over to that. How much work is involved in that, and make sure that you understand the steps to do that, and make sure that you've kind of recorded that, and make sure you've recorded that in a very clear way. One of the things that Andrew and I were talking about before is I had a client who basically had a requirement that their data be handed back to them, and the client got a telephone call from the loading dock saying that 2 pallets of paper had arrived, which turned out to be the data had been delivered to them in paper form. So be very clear around what it is that you need, and make sure that it's going to be workable on the way through to you.
Yeah, and often kind of standard form contracts don't do this in enough detail. And again, it's about the more you can have these conversations up front in the contract and both parties understanding what's required of them, the better. Obviously, suppliers don't want to be on the hook for a bunch of free stuff at the end of the contract. So, if there is some untangling and a whole bunch of services that need to be provided to get the data across to either a third party or back to the customer, there needs to be a kind of commercial transaction in relation to that, and the supplier needs to get paid. I guess the other point is liability around that data transfer, and we see a lot with suppliers who are transitioning off, obviously not keen to pick up the tab for any issues with the new provider and with the data going across to that new provider. So again, that's a conversation to have at the outset. I think in terms of just the final bullet point there, end user impacts, particularly important if I'm a customer or I'm servicing a customer in a sort of client-facing way. If the clients or the end users have some kind of key touch point with the supplier, then that's going to be a really fundamental thing to get clear at the outset. How are we going to transfer these customers or the end users from the supplier to a third party or back to the customer, because that's often where the rubber hits the road, and is the most critical thing for a customer is how it's treating its own customers.
I should clarify, of course, that the experience from our customer in relation to the pallet of data was not our contract to start with, so it wasn't some problem that we had created.
Very good. Yeah, always keen to make that clear. So that is that's a wrap on our kind of tour through tech transformation deals. Looking to see whether we've got any Q&A.
Got a couple
Looks
of
like
questions.
there's a couple here. If we can get into it, here we go.
Will the slides be available after the meeting? They sure will be.
So do I get the next one? Then,
you get
Simon?
the next one.
Yeah, excellent. So James Elliott has asked, given the challenges you've outlined with tech implementation, are you seeing customers rethink their business models, i.e. make the customer model fit the licensed tech rather than the other way around? Yeah, look, I think it does happen that way. Often in the kind of the scoping sessions, I think in those discovery processes, if a customer has kind of gone all in on a solution, then absolutely, if the scoping suggests that what they've got at the moment is not going to work, then yeah, look, sometimes the tech is so fundamental to them in the way that they manage their data, for example, or the way that they engage with their employees, that they absolutely will change processes. But partly that's the supplier's job, is to actually come in and tell them how they can do that. Yeah. On a consultant basis.
Yeah, and look, a lot of the kind of the slips happen as a result of an assumption around how the business is going to change to adopt the solution, and the solution will not change. part of the assessment that you have to make in terms of that scoping phase and as you go through the implementation is to actually understand, can you make this change? And so sometimes actually the project team is really important, and that's getting the project team to buy in, so that as part of the end user feels like they've got a voice, and that voice is being taken into account as part of designing the solution, so that there is an easier way in which the business will start to accommodate perhaps changes in the way that they have to operate. So there's lots of tools that can be used around the outside, but there is a degree of kind of having to accept, because that's a trade-off. Things have to be a little bit more standardized, but how do you get that standardized approach adopted by the business?
Very good. Good feedback from Paul Armstrong, thank you. And yes, we will be making the videos available, I'm pretty sure, Joe, is that right? Excellent. Yep, so that'll be coming up soon. Yeah, look, I think that's exactly right. The next comment around thinking about the end of the relationship at the start of it. As we've discussed, standard contracts often don't do this enough, and so you'll often get a termination clause that says immediately on termination, each party will stop using the material of the other and hand back any confidential information or data. Well, that's all very well, but if you haven't specified how that will happen or given a decent time frame for that to happen, or if you actually don't understand what data or information or services you're talking about, then that clause is very difficult to enforce. So it is something that we always look at really closely in these deals.
Yeah, look, I mean, and I guess coming back to where we started with all of this as well, I mean, I think the most important part in this whole process is having a conversation all the way through. What we've done in this session is we've kind of skipped through very quickly a range of kind of what we've seen as traditional kind of friction points within the deals that we've kind of had to be involved with. But it's about having those conversations, making sure that each side goes into them, understanding how you're going to work on these things, and that there is a clear path through them. There isn't going to be a right or wrong answer to it. It's about having that conversation, understanding the cost, understanding the risk, and understanding the benefit of the compromises that are made on the way through.
Excellent.
Great.
I think.
Well, we got one more question. No?
Scroll down. Oh, yes. Oh. So someone's chucked in a liability question right at the end there. Thank you very much, anonymous attendee. What trends are you seeing in liability clauses within SaaS?
I guess, I don't think that we're necessarily seeing a significant difference to what is, the standard approach around these things, but that doesn't mean that the standard approach is right. So often the starting point is something linked to the value of the contract in some way, whether that is value of the contract over its entire life, whether that's value of the contract per annum, and it may be that you need to kind of compromise in relation to that, and it may be that you have an implementation cost at the beginning, and so you want to have a larger cap on liability in that first period of time because you've got two aspects that you need to pick up, not just one. But as you get comfortable that the software is going to be business as usual, you drop that back to kind of a year's fees. The other part of it to think about though is that some of the things that used to be excluded may now not be appropriate to be excluded in terms of the types of indirect and consequential loss, or one of the ones that kind of still seems to appear from time to time is data loss is treated as indirect and therefore not able to be recovered. I'd question whether that is always the case now, given the importance of data going forward. So don't just kind of go, oh, this is a standard contract, these are standard clauses, therefore this is the answer. Yes, we are probably still seeing the same starting point as before, but again, there is no right or wrong answer to these things. It's looking at how it impacts on your business.
Yeah, and I think not necessarily taking a template approach is really important. Even things like confidentiality breach. So traditionally, we might always think, well, that's just uncapped, or data breach is potentially uncapped. We're looking much more at kind of, well, let's think about the specific deal, who's responsible for what, and perhaps actually in terms of a risk sharing mechanism, can we agree a separate cap for certain of these key points that's not going to put me as a supplier of the business, but that, you know, identifies the fact that I've got an important role to play in some of those key areas around SaaS, which is, you know, data and even IP as well, IP infringement. So yeah, look, I think it is about taking a bit more of a nuanced approach to liability. And as Simon says, having those kind of blanket exclusions often isn't going to work. And so that's where lawyers really need to dig into that detail and make sure that, you know, you're not just relying on kind of template thought processes and you're really considering the specific deal at hand.
So, yeah, thank you very much for everybody that's kind of sat through this. Hopefully this has been a useful exercise.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.